Welcome to the TransUnion Fraudcast, your essential go-to for all the absolute linkages between the day's emerging and fraud and authentication topics, trends, tropes, and travails, delivered with all the straight talk and none of the false positives. I'm your host, Jason Lord, VP of Global Fraud Solutions and a 15-year veteran of the fraud and marketing ecosystems, but enough about me. If you're tuning in for the first time, let me give you a quick overview. Each episode, we narrow in on a specific subtopic within the fraud and authentication universe, bringing on a special guest to help us dive in while keeping it high level enough that you don't need a PhD in data or linguistics, for that matter, and analytics to understand what's going on, because let's face it, as you can just tell, some of us didn't do so well in school, and yes, I'm talking about me. This week, we'll be talking about deepfake AI and its implications for document verification. So new account fraud, or sometimes called phantom fraud, is a type of deepfake that has already resulted in fraud losses of roughly $3.4 billion, according to FinTech Futures. With phantom fraud, fraudsters create a completely new identity using forged birth certificates or driver's license and prepaid SIM cards. They then use these fake identities to open new accounts with a legitimate telecom provider and use deepfakes to give it the face of a person who doesn't really exist. And with their real telecom account and their fake identity, they can then receive codes to beat all kinds of protections, including one-time passcodes, KYC, and two-factor authentication. And use of these deepfakes is exploding. It's a 330% increase year over year, according to DeepTrace. And yet fewer than 30% of businesses have a plan to combat deepfakes. In fact, many document verification solution providers in the market today are completely unable to detect and mitigate deepfake fraud because they rely either solely or mostly on determining the authentication of the document through biometrics, through visual inspections, which can easily be mimicked by deepfake technology. So, does this spell the end of document verification as we know it? Here to discuss this and much more is Eric Lambert, who has spent over a decade focused on fraud mitigation and identity resolution, with much of that time managing public response for several of the world's largest data breach events. Eric, welcome to the Fraudcast.
Jason, appreciate it. Looking forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. All right, so let's start here. Where are document verification solutions used most often, and what are they trying to solve for?
Yeah, this is one of the solutions that can pretty much be used throughout the entire customer journey. But what we see is the bulk of our clients and the bulk of the industry, I think, is using this as sort of a final step up. It keeps the client engaged, or the consumer engaged, if you will, and it gives the bank or the institution, whoever's requesting it, sort of that ability to send out an engagement in session and say, hey, we're almost done. Just need you to verify this is Eric, for example. And so a link would be sent out at that point and allow the client to go through and upload the document, take the selfie, and then that pulls it back in. So it's sort of the end of the authentication step point of the application process. But I wouldn't leave it there, like I said. This is a tool that can be used pretty much throughout the customer journey. It could even be the beginning of the customer journey. So when you first start, why not use the document itself to scrape out and sort of start that application process if the consumer gives you permission to. So pretty robust tool, gives you a lot of capabilities to utilize it.
And I imagine with a lot of interactions moving to online only or online majority, you're probably seeing a lot more of this technology being used than ever before.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was part of the team that helped build this up for TransUnion. Goodness, this was probably 5 years ago. And at the time, there were a handful of vendors that were out in the market providing the service. Today, there's a number of them. And it really is expansive depending on the application, meaning that sometimes you don't need all of the images to be taken. You don't need the front, the back, and the selfie. If you're in an in-person environment, you can still use this, but if I'm standing in front of a banker, would they really need for me to take a picture? Probably not. They can verify that just visually in front of me. So it gives a lot of functionality and a lot of flexibility to our clients to be able to pull and choose when and how to utilize the service.
Now let's dig into the topic at hand. When we talk about deepfakes and AI, and you speak to the clients and prospects that you speak to, how concerned are they about deepfakes and their abilities to fake out the biometric authentication measures? Is this a well-known or is it a well-understood problem?
I don't think it's a well understood problem yet. There's a lot of concern around it. There's a lot of press around it as well. In fact, there was a great article that was released yesterday on LinkedIn from Frank McKenna, or as we know, Frank on Fraud, where he did a great job of taking an AI application, pulling it through. He recorded a session, and then the application actually translated it and his mouth movement and everything to French and Spanish. It was really interesting. And when you look at the actual images and look at his mouth and how it's moving, it looks realistic. So I don't think there's been enough research to say how incredibly important or concerning is this going to be in the future. Everybody's looking at it. We heard recently, actually yesterday as well, I think Elon Musk and others were in front of the Senate talking about AI. So there's a lot going on right now. It is one of those emerging fields, both on the good side and bad side of fraud, if you will.
And knowing fraudsters who will find any loophole and exploit it as much as possible, if it's not well understood by the industry and it's as easy as we're describing here, no doubt we're going to be seeing a lot more of this type of fraud in the near future.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Even if you go back a couple of years, we saw a huge increase in the online movement. Everybody was staying at home, had to sort of transact with their banks via mobile or via web. And through that, we also saw the proliferation of this capability go out there. Even back at that time, we were seeing good fakes come through. The licenses look good. The images look good. But that was sort of just the beginning of it. In the future, I can only imagine that you can get a selfie that looks almost so realistic to Eric Lambert being right in front of you that it would allow you to say, wow, is this really him or not? And can the technology break that? Can it actually look into it? So it is going to be one of those things that we've got to watch, how to play with, how to work with. But I think it also falls back to there's not any singular point solution that can solve all of fraud. So that's where we talk to our clients and really go in and say, look, there's capabilities that you've got to look at layering, really looking at all of the tools in your fraud stack and how do those play with each other. If you don't mind, I'll give you a quick example of how that looks, here at TransUnion for our clients. So take document verification on its own. Much like a lot of the other services in the industry, we look at the front of the license, we look at the back of the license, and then we compare the selfie to the image that's on the license itself. Most of the time, that catches good fakes because there's stuff in the materials or the holograms or what we're looking at, the format of the license, that we can usually throw a signal and say, hey, this looks a little bit odd. You need to do a little bit deeper investigation on it. But it still will allow good fakes, really good fakes to come through. And if you're only looking at that singular point of that solution, you're going to let fraudsters come through. What we did on our side is we also created what we called triangulation of the service. So what that means is we took the response that we got back on the document, back on the selfie, and then paired that with our other solutions that are built into this core capability, which is looking at the device and also looking at the identity itself. And what I mean,
and just to be clear, I talked over you. When you say looking at the device, what types of signals are you looking at?
Yeah, great question. And sorry, I was sort of speeding through that.
All good.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, if you're holding your device and you go into the settings, you can look at all the configuration that's on that device itself. We pierce even deeper within that. So think of every capability that you've got to know within that device. The huge thing on our side that's driving a lot of our capabilities, though, is the consortium that all of our clients report back into. And so what that means is if I, Eric Lambert, is a fraudster, and I transact at a bank down the road and I charge off, they can go back in and place evidence. They now flag that device as being fraudulent. Well, now if I go to the bank down the street and try to transact again online, and they're using our tool, they can see that the other bank already flagged my device as potentially risky or risky. And at that point, it allows that bank to do a little bit more investigation on it or slow down the transaction, if you will. So that's a core component that's built into this document verification solution and brings together the whole triangulation. The one aspect, though, that a lot of people don't look at is the identity itself. And so that's really where the strength of TransUnion comes into play, because not only do we have the credit bureau, credit header related data on all of the consumers out there, you also have a lot of alternative data that's available. And so on that license, when we take the front and take the back, we're scraping the data out of the back of that license. And then we say, hey, let's run that through our identity verification. Do we have a match on the bureau? Do we have a match on the alternative data? And if we do, that again gives you additional insight, additional clarity, make a better decision on that. So I'll give you an example here of how triangulation works. If the license comes through and it's an incredible fake and actually bypasses the document scan, and we know there's some fraudsters out there using the right materials, everything, they're going to get through the service. That's going to come through as a pass. If he's done a good job, maybe his device comes through as a pass as well, unless he's been flagged by some of these other clients. But then when the identity comes across, that allows us to go through and say, hey, wait a second, these elements don't really match up. There's not any individual, on the bureau records or alternative records that has all of these different attributes, meaning a first name, last name, address, date of birth, those things that you find on a license that are truly combined. And now it looks like these things are being mixed between multiple consumers. So even though the device might come through clean, even though the license might be able to come through clean, that identity check now throws a flag that allows the investor to say, wait a second, something's just a little bit wonky here. Let me do a little bit more due diligence. And it's funny because one of our clients, this was a couple of years ago, we went through and they asked us to investigate some of the transactions that were coming through on their side. And again, it was the license looked perfect. The device was okay at first. And then the identity was just marking way off the score, meaning that it didn't match anything on that point. So we then went back and were able to take the device tag and do a little bit more research deeper on just that device. And we found 5 more transactions associated with that device. They were all document verification uploads. And what was interesting is we were able to tie it back, and we pierced through the IP that was coming through and actually saw that instead of it coming from Dallas or Chicago, which was a stated IP, our device signal actually was allowing us to pierce in and see this was coming from Lagos, Nigeria.
Interesting.
Once we did that, it gave us a great opportunity to say, hey, this is a risky device. It's coming from overseas, and now help that bank slow down the transactions coming through and stop.
It's interesting what you say, because as I talk to more and more fraud experts on a variety of issues, not just this issue, it feels like triangulation is the motif we keep coming back to. When we have these single-threaded approaches to fraud or authentication, inevitably a fraudster will find its way a way around the barrier. So it sounds like what you're saying is an effective approach involves not just a visual inspection or the biometrics aspect, but also device reputation. So has this device been associated with fraud in the past? And also PII, or identity information. Does this match the information that's provided, and does it match a real person that exists in the world? Did I get that right?
You did. Yeah, spot on. So it's really relying not on any singular decision, but the aggregated group of that. So even though our core document verification solution does combine all of that, for a client or bank or an institution that doesn't have that capability, leverage the stack that you've got though, and don't rely on any singular solution to make that final decision. Understand what's going on within the stack and how each one of the solutions you're utilizing is sort of ranking that one transaction coming through. So it does provide a lot of power by really looking across what is everything telling you versus just this one thing.
So let's come back to the market problem and be a little catastrophic for a second. So if we assume that a lot of organizations don't fully understand this problem, and we are seeing the rise of deepfake technology, what do you think that portends for the next year or so? Will document verification for a lot of organizations become unreliable? And if so, what does that mean for them?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. So if you are relying on a solution that is only looking at, is the document good, then quite possibly you are going to see deep fakes get through. You're going to see good fraudsters get through, just like we did on ours on the actual document check itself. But if you're relying on a solution that does what we've been talking about, that triangulation, looking across 3 or multiple services to make that final decision, it really limits how deep a fraudster can go. It limits because at some point they're going to make a mistake. It's not fail-proof. It will still allow certain people through, certain great fraudsters, great deepfakes, possibly, but it makes it incredibly difficult for them. And so I don't think there's any fraud fighter out there that would say, hey, I can stop fraud 100%. It's almost impossible. So at that point, how do you limit what the fraudsters can actually get into and stop? And that's by looking at the entire circle out there. So if you're looking at singular point solutions, yeah, it is going to be a little bit rough in the future.
Well, that point about 100% of fraud is interesting too, because presumably you could tighten the aperture tightly enough that no fraud would get through, but then the customer experience would be terrible, right? And then your conversion rate would decrease, your false positive rate would go up. And so as you think about putting these checks in place, presumably you need to think not just about preventing fraud, but also how do you find more of the good transactions and let them through with less friction.
That's exactly right. And so that triangulation comes back into play for the customer experience as well. Let's say you're dealing with a slightly damaged driver's license. We all have them. We don't really take care of them too well. That's going to come through and potentially be scored as risky because it might have a little nick taken out of it. And again, if you're only relying on that one solution, you now have the potential of classifying a good consumer as bad. That could be detrimental to your organization, definitely to that consumer, because they're reaching out trying to get this credit or this product. And now you're telling them no, just because their license is slightly damaged. But in person, you would say, yeah, this is Eric Lambert. I see his license. It feels right. Everything's right. Now that we layer in the triangulation, we could say his device is really good. There's no risk associated with it. We have an exact match on his identity, and there's no identity concerns associated with this. Now it allows that fraud investigator to say, this is actually a good consumer. I don't want to stop them. I want to actually help them and move through the process. So that triangulation helps with stopping fraud, but it also helps with improving the customer experience through it.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we understand the problem, and I feel like we have an idea of what the solution is, which is using multiple signals that are not just about visual inspection, also including device reputation and identity checks. So that's already very helpful. As you think about the document verification issue and then the larger fraud issue, and you talk to customers and prospects, if you had to give one piece of advice to the organizations you talk with, what would that piece of advice be?
Wow. I don't know if I'm
putting you on the spot right now.
Yeah, I know. It's a good one. And again, sort of like my answer's been throughout this, I don't think there's any singular point to get except for rely on your entire stack. Look at everything that you're utilizing, reevaluate everything that you're utilizing. Does it pair together? Does it give you consistent signals throughout the customer journey? And if not, improve upon that. But if you're limiting yourself to basically technology that was great 2 years ago, 5 years ago, fraudsters aren't. They're using the latest, greatest stuff out there. So just like we saw, we have fraud fighters out there using AI. You got to absolutely understand that your fraudsters are using AI, and you're going to see a lot of those deep fakes come along. So don't rely on any one decision on its own. Look at it across the factor of what you're utilizing.
Multiple solutions, test and evaluate, always be fighting.
You got it. That's exactly it.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. I feel like I learned a lot from this. Hopefully our listeners did as well. Thank all of you for tuning in as well. We hope you join us for upcoming episodes. In the meantime, on behalf of the Fraudcast, stay smart and stay safe.